which we strengthen support and connect conservation organizations and practitioners in Wabanaki homelands, now called Maine. Momentum is a field building organization that encourages bold systems change, leans into new ways of thinking, and centers relationships. I have had the luck and privilege to be coordinating this amazing team for this project. And as such, I have helped to hold and steer the research and the reporting. And then also with the help from this team, I wrote the final gap analysis and recommendations that are laid out in one section of the report. The full report actually contains the full 2 scans and then the gap analysis and the recommendations. I also was the author of the previous report and study for the Community Foundation from 2019. And in this iteration of this report, I felt it was really important to bring in a team of people to help with this really big task of this really big and important topic. And so I was really fortunate, lots of reallys, to be joined on the team by Tyler, Stephanie, and Deb. And so we're going to all introduce ourselves, and I'm going to pass it to Tyler.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tyler Kidder. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a nonprofit and philanthropic consultant focused on organizational development and strategic planning and research in the environment and conservation sectors in Maine. I also currently hold the position of Funder Network Manager with the Maine Philanthropy Center, facilitating the Maine Climate and Environmental Funder Network and the Maine Food Funder Network. And I previously worked as the Environment Program Officer at the Onion Foundation. And I'll kick it over to Stephanie.
Hi, I am Stephanie Guaregua Marol, and I am a steward of possibility. I am often organizing, I'm facilitating, consulting, or on a leadership team, bringing a living systems and conflict resiliency framework through my organization, Micro-Rising. So I help illuminate pathways to leadership development, group conflict resilience, repair, and relational mechanisms that are rooted in more supportive paradigms that make space for everyone's gifts to thrive. So towards sustaining collaborative and value-aligned futures, I've been working with the Nature Connection Network on a national scale, the Guelph Outdoor School in Canada region, and more locally, the capital area for New Mainers Project, and Momentum Conservation on this report. That's a little bit about me. How about you, Deb?
Thanks, Stephanie. Hi, everybody. Okay, so I also run my own consulting organization, and I'll just say I do a wide variety of things. I'm really passionate in general, no matter what community I'm with, no matter what's happening in, I think, asking difficult questions and sort of digging into deeper conversations, wider, like zooming out, wondering from different vantage points. In this particular team, I played a role that maybe I was thinking my mom would be really proud. I'm like a professional disruptor in terms of like the bringing in somebody who is a little bit maybe not directly sometimes involved, but really also somebody who knows a lot of the community and is asking good questions, asking tough questions, wondering. I also did a bunch of editing support in this project, and I'll just say, in general, really happy to be a part of this team and a part of this conversation today, which I think really is about modeling co-learning together, which is one of my passions, is sort of not knowing, but rediscovering possibility in community. So I'm grateful to be involved and to be a part of this beautiful team. And I'm going to pass it to you, Jess.
Great. Awesome.
I think maybe I can go next.
Yeah, that's great.
I'm and I'll add spotlight. So I'm going to give some background context and then I'll pass it back to you, Jess. So why this? Why now? And thinking about Maine Community Foundation. So I work as a community partner at Maine Community Foundation. The past few years I've been coordinating our Maine Land Protection and Conservation for All programs, as well as other programs at the foundation. Myself and a team at the foundation has been working on a new strategic focus area on climate, where we're really trying to bring more increased focus and resources towards implementing statewide climate goals. That's really included evaluating our climate and environmental funding. It's also included our president and CEO joining the Maine Climate Council. It's also included Maine CF creating a board and staff team to participate in the First Light learning journey. So the context of this report is really looking at Maine Community Foundation has been funding conservation work in Maine since the early 1990s. And in 2018, we re-examined and redesigned our grant-making approach and actually commissioned Jess Burton back then for a 2019 report on conservation in Maine. That led us to creating the two conservation grant programs, Maine Land Protection and Conservation for All. So today's report and the context of today is really a building on previous work that Maine CF and Momentum, formerly known as Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative, had been working on. In 2024 and 2025, Maine CF did an internal program analysis of our conservation programs and commissioned this 2025 report, really to help illuminate gaps in the field that Maine CF and philanthropy more broadly can have an increased impact on. As part of our climate initiative, we're focused. This report and this work had a strong focus on the funding side because we are interested in, given the wide variety of statewide goals and priorities tied to conservation in particular, like where there were philanthropic gaps. We also used today's report as part of a grant program redesign process with a team of many of which are longtime advisors to our grant programs. So as a result of this whole process, we did end up redesigning our grant programs to implement some of the recommendations from this report that we'll be discussing today. So I'll put a link in the chat to our new grant program, which is heavily influenced by this report today. Also, just a couple more notes on context. We are wrapping up, so Maine CF board and staff team are wrapping up the First Light Learning Journey this fall, and participating in this program over the past year has included making tangible commitments to Wabanaki land return. And that's really tied to some of the recommendations we'll talk about today from the report. Additionally, part of our goal with the field scan, the funder landscape process, convening funders, convening community advisors in the field for the redesign is all about the broader Maine CF climate strategies and supporting our nonprofit and philanthropic partners as the conservation sector in Maine continues to rapidly evolve. And I think it's important to note that this report, it's not complete and it's not an end point, but really this ongoing continuation of work to come as we shift and learn and evolve in the field. And I'll pass it to Jess if you want to add some more context on the process.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Stephanie. I think that, well, this is a super important time. Obviously, every time is important in and of its own self, but if I look at it in the context of, since I did the last report in 2019, we know that so much, like really, really disruptive things have happened in that time. The pandemic, George Floyd was murdered, climate as a sort of concept has become mainstream, then there's been greater Indigenous awareness, Wabanaki awareness in Maine and beyond. And now the current administration is disrupting many things. And so in that context, we really see the importance of conservation needing to expand, to grow, to become more complex. And I see that on the ground with my colleagues. I see people aware, responding, and being ready, needing to get, even more ready. And I see that in the nonprofit sector, and I see it growing in the funder sector too. And so I think that what Maine CF has done here to commission this report for themselves is also a gift to the community of philanthropists in Maine, in conservation funding in Maine. And in that vein, this sharing out is an invitation to all of you to join this conversation. This is a huge topic, right? And even with this expanded team that we developed, the 5 of us, we were able to bring in, that much more perspective, that much more lived experience, that much more experience. But it's still just the beginning, and is raising lots of questions. And we are hoping that that you all will come away with more questions of your own, and you'll continue to think about new ways of doing, new ways to think about this information. And even still, the amount of work that was done on this report is really amazing. And so I really want to encourage you to take some time to review the full report, which includes both of the scans that Tyler and Stephanie spent a lot of work and time and thought. They put so much into that, and it's really groundbreaking stuff. So I hope you can take time to do that for your own information. You will definitely feel smarter after you have gone through that. I know that I did. So I want to thank Stephanie and MCF for Maine Community Foundation for supporting us. This past year in my life has been really, there's been a lot of change. And as a result, on top of lots of other things, our schedule was sometimes really wonky. It's hard to move quickly with the team, which is okay, because not, everything needs to move quickly. It needs to move the time that it takes. But Stephanie and Maine Community Foundation were incredibly supportive. They accepted that, the idea that to change an outcome, you have to change the process. So we have we created a new process as part of this team. And all along the way, we felt supported, and Stephanie was able to really be right there with us. So a huge thank you to you, Stephanie, for that. And also to Tyler, Stephanie, and Deb for being part of this messy process that was really at times very hard, but we persevered and we came to a place of great learning. And I really have appreciated so much getting, the opportunity to work in this way. So I think that's kind of the context of kind of, what landed us into this spot. And now we're going to dig in to the report. So you're going to hear from Tyler on the information that she gathered on the funder landscape, all of that she took away from that and gathered, and then also from Stephanie. And then it'll pass back to me for some information on the gap analysis and recommendations. Then we'll go into some small groups and be able to discuss. And we really look forward to digging into this more with you today. And then if you want to continue digging afterwards, I'm definitely open and excited to do that because this is, I think, it's ongoing. We all need to be asking these questions all the time. So I think now I will pass it to Tyler.
Thanks, Jess. I'm Tyler Kidder. I introduced myself earlier, and I was in charge of the funder landscape portion of the scan. And on your screen, you can see a lot of words. And we just wanted to take a second to thank those funders who participated. And we gathered information a couple of different ways. So the goal was to investigate how private philanthropy in Maine is relating to the conservation sector and all the organizations and efforts within that sector. So I gathered information through a survey, through 2 focus groups on Zoom, another 2 individual interviews, and then publicly accessible tax data in an effort to determine, the type and the amount of financial support flowing through the sector, the gaps in that support, if there were any trends and dynamics within the system, and just generally get a sense for how Maine funders or funders funding conservation efforts in Maine are thinking about their impact in the field, with the goal to really help Maine Community Foundation review and develop their conservation grant programs, but also to inform the whole sector. So you can see we had, there were 12 funders who participated in the focus groups, and then 16 funders completed the survey, and there was a list of 9 funders who participated in both the survey and the focus groups. And then we did 2 additional interviews with staff of the Wabanaki Commission on Land and Stewardship and their Let Us Take Good Care of What Has Been Returned fund, which was very new when I chatted with them in the spring. They had not yet awarded their first round of grants. And then I also spoke to Julian Rowand at Maine Initiatives about the Outdoor Equity Fund and other grant programs that fall under Maine Initiatives and have some overlap with kind of the conservation sector in general. So some of the top findings, and just a note that I'll talk a little bit more about this, but funders who participated in the survey, some of them got in touch with me to ask clarifying questions. Others, took it on their own. And there was just a lot of diversity in the way folks were interpreting what is conservation, both how it's defined and the scope, what's in it, what's not in it. So while we do have some great sort of tidbits to offer through this report, just to harken back to what Steph and Jess opened with, which is this is not a comprehensive data gathering. This was a voluntary set of survey and focus groups, which in and of itself has sort of the voluntary bias. Those people who believe in participating in this kind of thing did participate. So it's their voices that we're really channeling. So just a note that these, the survey findings or the overall report findings on the funder side of things represent a fairly small group of respondents. So with that in mind, we asked how funders were funding and whether they were focusing in specific parts of the state of Maine or regionally or nationally, and whether they were focusing or restricting their funding to certain groups. And we found that most respondents did not dedicate their conservation funding to support specific communities or specific counties in the state of Maine. And then we asked them what different content areas they're funding in, and we used a set of standardized codes that are used to code tax information in an attempt to try and reconcile what we learned on the survey with what we found is publicly available, which there's a whole section of my report that talks about how that did not really go as planned, and that there's a lot of variation in how grants and organizations are coding that work. And it's not universally applied or practiced. So there's a lot of layers of information gathering that are inherently tricky, specifically with funding and philanthropists and funders. So within the sectors that we offered them, environmental education and biodiversity are the top 2 funding areas. From the large list of things that we deemed to be conservation or conservation adjacent, agriculture and food ranked the lowest. So of the respondents in Maine, the fewest number of funders indicated that they are making agriculture and food related grants. Most of our respondents are providing general operating support, which honestly is something we should all be celebrating. There's also a little bit of a bias in that those organizations that are most likely to support and participate in a survey and focus groups are also those who really understand why trust-based philanthropy practices, including operating support, are valuable. And of the long list of things we asked how they were funding, the methods for funding, and types, the least number responded that their funding is going to DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion work, capital campaigns, organizational mergers, and workforce development. And we know that this is a rapidly changing field. So there are some trends that there's a lot of interest in pursuing more intersectional approaches and talking about how food is part of conservation and how we kind of need to think differently about how conservation is defined and scoped. There's also a need for additional flexible financial support, specifically for land return and rematriation projects in Maine. And there's a demand for additional stewardship funding. And this is mostly from our land holding conservation organizations, such as land trusts. You might think about that. They're getting the double whammy of intense increased storm effects, which are damaging to trails and properties in general, as well as an increased use from the pandemic and an increased interest in making more accessible trails, which then, of course, demand resources to do so. And like I said, some challenges in the work that funders differ widely on how they define conservation. And the majority of the funders who participated did not indicate that they do formal standardized evaluations either of their own programs or of the programs that their grantees are performing. And then we did do 2 specific interviews, like I mentioned. We wanted to make sure that these voices were included, but didn't want to push them to do a standardized survey or participate with mainstream funders in a focus group. So found time to do individual interviews a little bit later in the process. And through some themes that emerged from those interviews are how helpful it would be to adopt a land justice framework. So moving a little bit away from a narrowly defined scope of conservation and words like preservation and conservation, and thinking instead about how land justice could be defined in Maine, what it could look like, and who should be included in that work. There's also were multiple calls to build further relationships with the Wabanaki communities in general, and specifically the Wabanaki Commission on Land and Stewardship, which is the rest of the name of that organization. There's a need to fund research that's led by Wabanaki communities to redefine conservation and the metrics. And Stephanie is going to talk a little bit more about that. And that as a part of that, there should just be more Indigenous voices represented in all of the reporting and the decision-making as it happens. And then there's a need for access to capital for BIPOC-led infrastructure. And I'm a big fan of explaining acronyms. So if you aren't familiar with this acronym, it's Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. So organizations that are led by BIPOC individuals are in greater need of flexible funding and capital support for infrastructure. We can trace this back to a lack of infrastructure that has been accessible to these groups in the past, and just a need to make up for that difference of many years of systemic racism. And then there's opportunities to collaborate a lot more with Outdoor Equity Fund. It's very, it has a lot of overlap with other work that funders in Maine are doing. And just some key takeaways. I mentioned that it reflects a small funder sample. So the combination of, we've got this great and committed handful of conservation funders here in Maine who participated, which we're really grateful for. We got a lot of good information. It was also just nice to have people talking to each other in the focus groups. But philanthropy in general is a fairly opaque system, and it makes finding information and finding good quality information pretty hard. And so it just demands that we commit to ongoing learning and trust building and relationship building. That if we really want things to change, that's reports like this are part of that, but they are not the beginning or the end of that, and there's just more to be done. And there were pretty inconsistent understandings of conservation. So it's not uniformly defined or interpreted across Maine funders. And we did create a project definition of conservation, and funders interpreted its relevance to their work differently. Um, so some funders did not identify as conservation funders at all and didn't participate. Um, and relatedly, there was some confusion about the meaning of community access to land in the definition that we created. So there was sort of this initial going into it, I would write to people and I'd be like, you seem like the kind of funder that should participate. And they would write back, I didn't think I was a conservation funder. And so, there's some holes and some gaps, but it was also a great learning. And that we have a bias in focus group towards valuing convening. So the people who participate in focus groups are the kind of people who value convenings. So there's an outsized, perhaps, recommendation on convenings. However, we also know that those are a really effective tool in the work, especially for ongoing relationship building and systems change and trust building. And just a final note that we are just very, very fortunate to already have a close, collaborative, and committed conservation and environmental funding community in Maine. Some funding networks that have been around for almost 20 years, lots of personal relationships, lots of commitment to that, which made, I think, getting the amount of information we got very easy. And so I have a lot of appreciation for the community that already exists, and I think we can continue to grow and strengthen it as well.
Thanks, Tyler. Any questions for Tyler before we talk about the field scan portion with Stephanie? If you do have questions, you can put them in the chat. We will talk about the field scan next. There we go. On to you, Stephanie.
Thank you. This is the list of reports that were reviewed. As you can tell, it's not a really big pool to start. And to what Tyler has already kind of spoke to a little bit, or maybe alluded to, is that there's just a lot of varying perspectives. And that is certainly something that was very clear in across these reports. There's reports with differing assumptions underlying each of their creations. They each had different approaches to how they were even writing the report, and orientations, etc. So the reports were just offering a lot of different perspectives just to give you an idea of what success looks like in the sector, or what fighting climate and environmental change means, how we're going to achieve that, and who should be included. And so what I found is that there's just a kind of natural tension that was, or it kind of is seen, kind of emerging, looking at all of those reports. And I wanted to talk about a little bit, if you read the full report, which I just want it to be clear, is that wanted to make an acknowledgement, maybe specifically, that there really isn't any objectivity per se in the way that this report was made. But maybe the acknowledgement more so is that it is very clearly influenced by the perspectives, the lived experiences, the studies, the education I've had, the lenses that I'm reading through, despite my efforts of broadening and also zooming in the process. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. And there's something in the report that you might read where I kind of like looked at all of the reports and came and kind of concluded that the shape of the reports and their content and their orientations kind of could take the shape of what's called a bimodal distribution. So when you look at a graph, it almost looks like hills in that, where there was just like between those reports, there's just like a lot of concentration on like at the top of that of like two hills. Is the best way that I can describe it right now. And so I made a distinction between those two, that there was a lot of reports that fell between two modes, and I called them mode A and mode B. And mode A referenced some of these themes, like there were a lot of distinctions between what is wild land and what is human occupied land. There was assumption almost of a continuation of that there was a socioeconomic continuity, meaning that, for example, if there was like an emphasis on the efficiency and the desire for more electric cars, there's a presumption that um, individualized motorized transportation at these current scales is sustainable or even attainable for the majority of the population, as an example. Or some of the reports in Mode A also, I noticed that didn't really document much data on what the largest sources of climate catastrophe are. There weren't very many mentions of that. And so while Mode A reports carried some intersectional views and perspectives and how they were created and what their orientation and focuses were, there wasn't much inspection perhaps of like what's underlying in those assumptions, or where power lies, or even status quo. Reports in Mode B were really focused on some of the themes within that were like interconnection, kind of like dissecting a little bit, like what do we mean by humans are land and are living, and vice versa, or themes of really valuing lived experiences of a people, or the acknowledgement that there is socioeconomic differences, and those realities are both, happening now and also are historic as well. And my point about the bimodal distribution, I think that's a really fancy word, but mostly just categorizing these two themes of reports. Something that feels super important to mention is that that there were obviously some reports that fell between Mode A and Mode B. And that when you think about that graph as those hills, that the valley between the modes is actually rising. And so it kind of shows that there is a growing body of work attempting to weigh and hold binaries together, right? To weigh these frameworks of both A and B. So I just wanted to note that because, another clear thing from these reports was that consensus actually does exist across these reports, despite having those kind of really like large valleys of those modes. And consensus existed mostly on these three scales. One was the acknowledgement that there are obvious escalating impacts and risks due to climate change. So that was kind of clear across all reports. Good for us. That there is care for and also investment in land stewardship, also amazing. And surprisingly, but maybe not so surprisingly, but the last one is that there is an obvious need for immediate and substantive action. We needed to do something now. And so that's really what I was like really excited to see that that was coming through across all of these reports. And that's really amazing. Some other themes as well that are, I think, worth noting is that organizations in these sectors, in the conservation, land trust, environmental, and the funding fields have taken big steps to answer a lot of the calls that have been made from historically marginalized and marginalizing communities to center relationships in their work. And so to me, that's you know, it's telling that there is trust that is slowly building as organizations are making changes to how they work, you know, taking action alongside the communities that they serve and are a part of or are immediately in. And that there is growth toward intentional understanding of equity, anti-oppression, and decolonial work, and those impacts and those effects on what we consider conservation and land trust and just land and human social circles as well. And so the shift, funny enough, is part of why there is kind of a bit of a natural tension growing across the sector, and that tension is a symptom of the sector undergoing those changes and those shifts, right? That's why the lines or the valleys between the bimodal graphs is actually leveling almost. Not quite there, but it's growing in that direction. And very generally also more about the reports. The reports were like very clearly informed by strong empirical research pertaining to climate change and conservation. There was research on class and socioeconomic status and access and research on access to land that clearly played a role in advancing the awareness of racial disparities and economic insecurities related to climate and the environment and the state. Okay, so you know, all of that was really mostly about like report orientations and focuses and the how, which is already super fascinating. But the next two that I want to name, I would say are really where the meat of our collective effort could make a huge impact. Because what was really notable was that across these reports, there's like a really huge distinction, like almost a binary between what is conserved land, let's call that like preserved, protected, or like untrammeled, and then agricultural land. And it's notable that these fields have room to grow in their understanding of how human activity, specifically the practice of cultural lifeways and foodways, have a beneficial impact to biodiversity, local community, economy, and climate. And the last point that I just want to make about these reports too is that, you know, Tyler, I think you've mentioned this already as well, is that, you know, we could do more work on trying to come to a more aligned or shared definition on conservation. And what was clear from these interviews and from the reports and their orientations was that there is a desire and even a need to include communities of people and more activities that connect people to land and vice versa, and to clarify what the work of conservation and all of its purposes is trying to change, and seeing what answers to collectively we can come to that help us align as organizations and also across the sector for greater and broader impact that includes all of these factors. So those are some highlights that I wanted to be sure that I pulled out for all of you in case you don't get to reading the report.
Thanks, Stephanie. Maybe I'll just take a pause. If there's questions for Stephanie, there's also some questions in the chat that Tyler, looks like you're responding in live time. Feel free to either type a question in the chat, like Anne has some great modeling, and we can respond to it in the chat, or you're at any point welcome to use the raise hand feature and come off mute and ask a question also. I'm working on my tech here. Hi, William, Bill.
Yeah, hi, I'm William Labick, and I use they, them pronouns. I'm with HISET Foundation, and very thankful to Tyler for mentioning this program, for the opportunity to hear about this report. I can't wait to dig into it. A question I have is, and I'm wondering if you actually are going to get to this, so I apologize if I'm jumping the gun, but I'm wondering if there was a way to identify roadblocks to funders being more effective at addressing kind of the societal challenges. It seems like there is an interest in that intersectional approach, but the question is like, what is the roadblocks to people, funders working to develop programs that, present solutions to working intersectionally? And I'm just curious, is that talking to some funders, they think that's a great idea, that intersection of land use and conservation, centering justice with climate change in mind. Okay, but what does that mean? And if there are funders that are doing that work, I think it'd be beneficial to know about that. And if you found something out during the, analysis, that would be great to know about. Thank you.
Is that me?
I feel like that's a good segue to talk about some of the gaps and recommendations, and a great question to ponder in discussion. But yeah, if Jess, Stephanie, or Tyler, if either of you want to speak to that now, or I don't know if Jess feel like you're up next, if you feel like your section is gonna speak to that question.
I don't think that I will be talking about that. And because I'm so prepared to talk about that, my brain has no elasticity to actually answer that question, William.
Okay.
Although I think it's an excellent next step. So like maybe you just named the title of the webinar that's going to follow this one in, like 4 months. And it's a call out to those folks in this room who have examples. Just from my brain, that's just my brain. And that's why, as I said, having a team of people working on something is so good, because there are other brains in this room. But I think because it is, I think there's a lot there. So if it's okay, I'd like to go on with my presentation, and then we can sort of see how we circle back to that. I think it's a great frame for us to be thinking. William, anybody that knows me knows that I'm a fan of questions. It's all about the questions. And so I also just want to raise up some of the questions that were just raised from Tyler and Stephanie around like, what is the work of conservation trying to change, and that goes to like the evaluation framework, the impact. What is that? And that also goes to like, what are some examples, and I think, William, you're kind of raising that question. So thank you for that. So now what what I then kind of did with this amazing work that you just heard a bit about is I went through, analyzed, and pulled together essentially with my purpose was to develop recommendations for the Maine Community Foundation around how their funding could really support their goals. And so part of that was to pull out significant gaps that were identified in the scan. So some of them are from one scan or the other, but they have echoes, and some were clearly in both scans. And so you can see these 6 are here. They're summarized, and some of them were already discussed, but I wanted to just give a little bit more information on a few of these. Also, I just want to echo something that Stephanie said around the subjectivity of this work. And that is true. Like the subjectivity that I, used it was hard to get away from. I tried again with the team, but there is, my experience, what I see, I've been in this work for a long time. I work for this organization that has a point of view. And so, I just want to acknowledge that and say that a lot of data that was collected do support what we have here. So just to back up a couple of these things, one of the gaps is focused on the 30 by 30, the state's goal to protect 30% of the state land by 2030, and we have said here that it's controversial and simplistic. So that's, perhaps it's a conversation many of you have been part of, but basically it's very simple. Not all conservation land has the same climate value. So that's one of the simplistic things about it. And there's just not an agreement on what counts as conserved lands. So again, it's this broad swath. There's so much more we need to consider when we're thinking about this goal, and that's informing recommendations that you'll see coming next. I also wanted to just note the availability of flexible funding for innovative conservation projects, including land return, is very limited. So land return projects are, we're learning as we go. In a lot of cases, they're complicated, and often they don't qualify for state or federal funding. They're also, we know that tribes cannot accept land that is encumbered with conservation easements. That's a simplification, but the broad statement is true. And so we're looking and needing to develop new tools, and that takes time. That takes, expertise. That takes lots of different people thinking together. And then also this term land return is not only about land ownership, but it's also around access. And so that could contain the idea around harvesting. And we really need to, again, develop more conservation tools that have broader applicability. This next one is really important for field building, and we really need more opportunities for people in the conservation community to come together and to be knitted. And that's both practitioners, but also funders. This is one of the big, muscle builders for action and for protection. As we're seeing funds being pulled, as we're seeing various other threats, this community needs to be stronger. And one of the ways to do that is for us to build relationships and come together. And so that's really important. And then the last piece I just wanted to raise up is the food production. We saw that in both reports, that there is really just not an understanding of how food production, food collection, food systems are very connected with conservation. And that's specifically to the small scale community-based agriculture, as well as indigenous practices of harvesting native and naturally growing plants. This is an example of activities that connect community with land. and that links deeply culture, community, climate, and conservation. And in fact, there's a goal that this relates to in the state's plan that 30% of our food will be grown locally by 2030. And so this is a way to kind of attend to that goal, if we pay more attention to bringing food as a concept into conservation. And now I can go to the next. So out of the gaps, we have presented some recommendations. So this first one is a group of 3 recommendations that we see as opportunities to build power and to start creating some new information, new data for a vision into the future around what is actually important to all these different communities. And so these are just ideas, recommendations to perhaps target specific communities, which the ones that have been marginalized, that have been excluded from reports, or I should say not included perhaps, from reports. And so using the relationships, using the dynamics of funders with application opportunities, there's just a really rich amount of data that comes through in those applications. And that in and of itself, that information can inform what's happening in communities, what's a vision for communities. And similarly, we're seeing, we could do that with underserved geographic areas. There are parts of the state that are not getting very much conservation funding. Part of that is because large organizations are not based there, or there are just not a lot of people. But if we were to target certain underserved areas, we'd get some of those smaller community-based programs, and we'd start building those relationships and empowering those communities. And then related to the climate goals, again, in the same vein, we could use this feedback loop, this communication tool of applications, essentially, to start developing our new vision for our climate future. What are people in communities seeing? What do they need? And what do they envision? So then to expand the definition of conservation, and really build out what it contains, what it relates to, and to what Tyler mentioned around the land justice framework, perhaps marrying those two together, really thinking about land return and thinking about how to lean into support organizations that are participating in developing new tools, building relationships, getting ready to be available for land return. So that's one. And then food access and production on conserved lands. Again, this is, it's not something we've spent a lot of time thinking about. And I really think, you see land trusts around the state that have farms. They're protecting farms, or they themselves have farms. Maybe that could happen more, or maybe there are just lots of different ideas around that. And so just encouraging that, start thinking and looking into that. And then the third, so then this is around field building. We really need connections. We need strength. We need to understand each other. We need to be aligned. And so supporting the convenings for groups to come together, whether it's regionally, whether topic-wise, they're happening out there. There are organizations and networks that are doing this, but then, smaller organizations are doing it within their communities. So just opportunities for people to come together and build relationships. And then we found that in the philanthropic sector, there's not a lot of communication and understanding of how the different funding mechanisms actually add value or fit or nest. And so opportunities for funders to come together specifically to talk about these things for greater connectivity and cohesion. And then the last is really focusing on, the impact and evaluation. I guess I don't need to see that screen, but basically we need to understand evaluation. I don't think we really understand it. And so there's a growing body of work around evaluation, but let's really start thinking about evaluation talking with grantees around that, evaluating the the foundation's work themselves, but also supporting the learning in the sector around evaluations, because a lot of nonprofits don't really even know what that means. We're just going and going and going and going on to the next thing. Okay, now I'm ready for the next slide. So we made 3 recommendations to the Maine Community Foundation for different types of funding. That was part of our request. So you can see this echoes out what we've been talking. Basically, flexible funding for land acquisition, unrestricted funding. A lot of organizations are already doing that, and then dedicated pools of funding for convening and research. I think that's just a really important part of this work, and that it's underfunded. So I think that's the last slide for me. Yeah. So thank you for listening, and I'm going to turn it over to Deb.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I know there's a few people who have to sign off early, but for those who are here, I mean, I don't know about you, I was part of the process, but even still, I've just been thinking and noodling as I'm listening. And our invitation is to do that in small groups with each other a little bit, to take some time. And you'll see some prompts. I always love to also break the rules. If you don't want to talk about any of the prompts, you don't have to, but we're really hoping that what you'll do is talk to one another. What did you just hear? How did it land for you? So what is resonating or exciting for you? What might be confusing or you have questions about? And then also you might have an aha or a takeaway, a piece that is really you want to highlight. And when we come back together, we'll have a little bit of time to share those out with one another in the spirit again of ongoing learning together, and that conversations also can help us sometimes to gather our thinking and our questions. Back.
Welcome back. Thank you for sticking with us.
It's
Always
always so
hard to do a
strange.
breakout.
It is. It really is. Just a moment to share as you're entering back into this room together. Are there conversations or comments, thoughts that you all had in your short conversations that you'd like to share in this larger room? Also in the chat, if you feel more like that. Yeah, Bill.
Yeah, I'll chime in for our group. We did talk about kind of next steps and how, assuming that funders are interested in this work and cross-sector work, how is it that we move forward if we understood and recognizing that some groups, some organizations, and some foundations are funding things that are like the beginning steps in this approach, and so that was recognized. But what we kind of landed on was the role that funders could play is in the convening, to create as someone said, the collective vision for facilitating that conversation of the intersectionality. And then it would be important to recognize who are the people who are defining it. What does this mean, even? Just kind of like conservation. What does conservation mean? Yeah, so I think that was so the power of, and also the power of a small group of people, because I was wondering also, okay, what's next with this report? Because I was saying, like, I read the recommendations just in the, and I'm thinking I'm all in. That's how I felt. Then the question is, okay, well, what does that mean? And who am I working with? Blah, blah, blah. And then also just quickly, how many groups have funding that's somewhat flexible that could be tweaked to go in a new direction towards building capacity in this way? I think that's where change can happen. And thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. And I'll just open it for one moment too. Anyone from the team want to respond or anyone else want to sort of, yeah, share back? Thanks, Bill.
I appreciate that you had that discussion. And I think that's a really great way to move with that information. And I'll just acknowledge that the report was, the focus recipient audience of the report was for the Maine Community Foundation. And the Maine Community Foundation has its own set of sort of approaches, restrictions, opportunities, and there was intention and hope that this would be shared with both the staff at the foundation, also the advisors, as well as the donor advised fund holders. And so um, I think what you're saying speaks to kind of a broader or a different audience and the opportunity that sits with that group that's already sort of in the conversation, in the knowing, in the trying is really important. And it is so essential that that group takes the edge and keeps fighting and breaking and, striving through that edge, cutting it for the others. So just sort of like holding that, and know that we have 11 minutes left. So I won't go on because I could go on. But thank you.
Jess. Yeah, I'll just open up and just maybe one or two other quick comments or thoughts from your small group conversations, if there are any to be shared at the moment.
I'll just say, well, first of all, thank you. Thanks to the Community Foundation and the team. That was really hard work and good work. So, you surfaced a lot of important issues that we all need to be thinking about. So thank you so much. In our group, we talked about a bunch of number of things like the definition of conservation and really spending some more time with that. And particularly, I'm interested in like the intersection between the agriculture and conservation, and understanding and learning more about the co-benefits piece. Like, where can we get more and better information and examples of that? And we also talked about the importance and excitement around convening both practitioners with funders, and then funders among themselves, with really having more conversations with the state, to the extent that they're currently involved at all, the federal agencies, individual donors, donor advisors. That seems like a really important thing to move things forward, is to have a better sense of the whole ecosystem of who's supporting this work and who's doing what and how. And I know I sound like a broken record because I pretty much say this at every MCEFN meeting, but an opportunity to say it again. But I think we all in our group felt like there's possibility there to have some more conversations that are both inspiring and learning possibilities. So thanks again.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Anne. And I'll pass it to Stefan just for a moment. I think I just want to highlight that last thing you said, which is having more conversations. And that's that both the humility for all of us of not knowing, and the singularity of just one perspective, but this broadening, like we tried to model on this team, of just multiple ways of viewing something. So just thank you for that reminder of how important it is, even if we're saying that over and over, to take those steps toward continuous conversation, continuous learning, and new ways of moving and action. So Steph, I'll hand it to you. Yeah, thank you for being in those small groups.
Yeah, I was just putting in the chat and thinking about like a next step. An example of a next step is this new grant program that we just launched, which is funding, Wabanaki stewardship projects, land return projects. We really framed it broadly as land for food because while we certainly are funding and want to be funding farmland conservation, we kept the language more broad and thinking about like other intersectional ways that communities interact with food in the landscape. And we're really learning a lot from this program, and a lot of you are really key partners for us and would love to talk and share about like, this is what we got for the scope of proposals this first round, and this is how this is going and evolving. And I'm just going to share one last slide here. Just it was kind of a lot of information today. So some if you can only remember a few things, a few takeaways to just be thinking about in our work moving forward. And Deb, Tyler, Jess, Stephanie, if you want to illuminate or add to any of these in our last few minutes here. I'm also gonna keep monitoring. Thanks. Multitasking with my tech.
You're doing an awesome job, Steph. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I guess I'll just say, even though there was a bit of a selection bias towards convenings, I am also of the opinion that the funder community is really expressing its interest in getting together, not just with itself, but with practitioners and nonprofits. And I think there could be a lot of value in a series of convenings that are built around exploring land justice as a framework and that are created with the express goal of building relationships between all these different groups who often do end up working in silos. And I think we're so lucky in Maine that we're kind of a small state and we already know a lot of these people, but there's a few more that we need to meet and a few extras that we need to welcome and blend more. So I get excited when I think about that. And we're also lucky that we already have a couple of tools up our sleeve to make this happen, including the funder networks that MPC holds and that many of you participate in. So, call me if you want to talk more about that.
I'll just say, Stephanie, I don't know, or Jess, I'll just add, I think taking risks, it's one of the hardest things to do, but even if that is risk, to reach out after this webinar and have an additional conversation, right? Or to think, to take something that you learned today, something that really struck you, and to move with it. I think oftentimes, yeah, just being bold and brave to continue to wonder about whether it's questioning current assumptions or allowing new questions to emerge. But again, thank you so much for being here and being, uh, I think, curious, amazing people already.
Yeah, I would say, Alyssa, did you want to say something? I saw.
Yeah. I just wanted to say thank you to everybody and all the work put into the report and the questions and the challenges and the care that clearly went into this. I work for a funder that supports a range of environmental conservation efforts, broadly defined, and also in support of Maine Community Foundation. And so just like, it seems to me that we're part of a growth process, an evolution. And I think, taking these moments to just sort of stop, check, think, rethink, retool, re-relate, is worthwhile. And, for myself, speaking for myself, having been in some role or another in the conservation field for close to 40 years, from biologist, scientist, policy, funder, it's, I think there's a lot of activity going on simultaneously, and how it all gets teased apart towards strategy, is challenging. It is challenging. And at the same time, I also feel that, Maine Community Foundation can play a convening role because of its statewide focus, because of its community focus, um, along with others, of course. But I just think that just reflecting on the convening role that funders can play. And, I think MCF is uniquely positioned because they kind of, yeah, I mean, many funders do, but holding both the very, very grassroots, the very startup, the very sort of inkling of an idea, along with how do we respond to these massive projects and big needs and, leverage the donor relationship. So they're in an interesting position. But I guess I would just echo that we're all learning together, and I appreciate the effort that's been made to pull this together and pull us together. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Yeah, there's so many things that I want to say, but we have 2 minutes left.
I know.
Yeah, one thing I said this in the report, and I think it's so true, is that Maine Community Foundation actually is sitting on such an incredible wealth of information and feedback from all the county funds. Like, just all the county funds get so many applications. All these different organizations are answering all this question, and that information is sitting there waiting to be read. Even if they're not getting funded, that information is there. And so that is really an amazing temperature check for the rest of us. Like, that's so there is such an amazing opportunity for MCF, and I'm so glad that we had this opportunity to work with them. So yeah, there is an important role to be doing that. And yeah, look at that thumb. Good thumb. That's a strong thumb. And yeah, so anyway, there it is, the last minute. But really appreciate all of you. If you want to talk more, please reach out. This team, we really do like working together. So maybe there's something else we can do together. Lots of ideas came up today. Yeah. And
Stephanie or Deb, do you have any mic drop before we
mic drop?
1
We don't
minute
have
left? Don't physically have a mic.
I gave mine. Yeah, be
Okay.
bold.
There's no, we need
Stephanie,
to,
how
we need
about
to get
you?
Zoom to do that. Like, we don't have an emoji for the mic drop. Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for hanging with us, and happy to continue the conversation. Thank you all so much.